Welcome to Word Pictures, a program of discussion and discovery. We examine the stories, events, and persons as described in the Word Pictures, presented in the 66 books of Scripture we know as the Word of God. But what kind of God is pictured here? By reading these stories, some become fearful, others adore. Yet others are just confused. Come, let us see for ourselves in an unrehearsed, no-question-barred discussion with people just like you as we search for the God of these stories. What picture of God will emerge for you? Let's join the discussion right now.
Welcome to our discussion. We're so glad that you have joined us. Recently, we have been beginning a summary of 10 years worth of discussions, and we are in the book of Exodus and going to make some summaries about from Exodus to Deuteronomy. Let's read from Exodus chapter 1, and let's start with verse 1. I'll be reading from the Message Bible. These are the names of the Israelites who went to Egypt with Jacob, each bringing his family members: Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. 70 persons in all, generated by Jacob's seed. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, that whole generation. But the children of Israel kept on reproducing. They were very prolific, a population explosion in their own right, and the land was filled with them.
That's a serious problem if it's not your land.
Right. Why were they down there?
That's a good question. I think it was the providence of God. It turns out that when Abraham went down to the land of Egypt, we talked about that a little bit last time, and lied about his wife, and Pharaoh, after Pharaoh had taken her and wanted to make her his wife, Pharaoh made a decree. He said, those people who herd sheep and cows, we don't want to have anything to do with them. Keep them out of here. We're superior to those people. So, some years later, when the children of Israel came down, they said, oh, you herd animals, you herd sheep, you herd cows, you stay over there, we'll stay over here. And what was the result of that? If the children of Israel had stayed in Palestine, they would have melted into Palestinian society. If they had been mixed right through all of Egyptian society, they would have melted into Egyptian society. God put that wall around them so they could do exactly what you read about right there. They became a nation down there in Egypt. That's what happened. And I think God directly engineered that.
Does God need to isolate his people now in order to get a people?
Well, that's a good question. We would probably be better off if we were a little more isolated. On the other hand, we need to be out there telling the world about the second coming, so you can't be isolated to do that. So there we're stuck. You got to play both sides of that issue. But having suggested that, what do we know a little bit, at least a little bit, it don't take a long time, about the condition of things in Palestine and the condition of things in Egypt in Moses' day and Joseph's day, for that matter, if you want to go back?
After Joseph or at the time of Joseph?
I was thinking at the time, sometime during this time, between Joseph and Moses. What do we know about the conditions?
Well, it was a Canaanite society. It was a pagan society.
Yes.
that was residing there.
Mm-hmm. And Abraham had been sent to them as the first foreign missionary. And he wandered up and down that land and converted a significant number of people. We know at one time that he had, remember, 318 fighting men who were capable, knew how to draw the sword, it says. He went and conquered 5 kings with his personal army. So there were people he converted that joined him and so forth, but the rest of them were pretty evil. And the Sodom and Gomorrah story gives us a hint about that from Genesis 18. But now we come over into this time, we can see God has given those Canaanites a period of probation, and their time of probation is just about over.
The Hebrews, Abraham's descendants, certainly weren't multiplying like the promise seemed to indicate. The God had told Abraham he was going to have, descendants as many as the stars of heaven and the sand of the sea. And here, after all of this time, it's kind of like about the best Jacob is able to do here is 12 sons and a few wives.
Well, that's better than his father did, and better than his grandfather did. Grandfather came up with one that really counted. His father came up with 2. Jacob at least came up with 12. So
It's a great curve.
Exponential.
it's heading like that, huh?
Ken, you said that God gave Canaanites a time of probation. By that, I think you mean that God gave the Canaanites a time to learn about him, to follow him, and when they didn't, it's over. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was teaching them?
Abraham.
Abraham. That was
At least
back-
for
and Isaac
a
and
time.
Jacob.
Yeah.
And then who was teaching them? Well, the Israelites were down in Egypt.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Nobody that we know of. But they already had information. They were familiar with the Abraham thing. Some of them must have gotten the message. I mean, it says, Norm read to us, only the family of Jacob are specifically mentioned as having gone down in Egypt. Where are all the rest of the people that worked with them? All their servants, etc. Did they all go? Was that included?
Probably.
Or did they stay behind?
Yeah.
You know, you do get a mental image of it's just Jacob and his
Immediate family.
immediate family. So what happened to all those people that were part of Abraham's, well, Jacob left Rebekah, and I guess Rebekah stayed with all of that, all of that big camp and so forth. It would have, certainly Israel would have kind of inherited that, all those servants and everything, and then when Jacob left, why, it would have been there with Rebekah.
Mm-hmm.
So then the picture, it's like that whole group of people just kind of disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they probably became part of it through intermarriage, part of the Israelite community.
Like what would have happened to Israel if they'd have stayed up there?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Back in those days, the women didn't count, and probably servants didn't count. So
Yeah.
the 70 might have actually been a larger group than 70.
So what did the Egyptians have in mind when they said, well, kill all the male Israelite boys, the newborns?
Well, the first thought that comes to your mind is if all the males are gone, then there's nothing. You kill one or the other, either all the males or all the females, and there's no way for them to reproduce among themselves. If you get rid of the men, then you're going to get rid of any soldiers and people take up arms. So that's the first thing that one might conclude.
And the other side of that is that women were expected to take the religion of their husbands. Mm-hmm. So if they're going to marry Egyptian husbands, what happens?
Get rid
They
of
become
the-
Egyptian culture.
It's a good way to convert them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So clearly the devil intended, I mean, this is one of the times in history where the devil really thought maybe he could eliminate the Israelites. He could eliminate God's people. And he just didn't quite work.
Is it conceivable that the devil may have thought that, we know the promised Messiah came, several thousand years later, but the devil may have, is it possible he, like others who believed that Messiah was coming, could come at any moment? Is it possible he could have believed that now would be an opportune time? You've got all the Israelites right here together. Now would be a real time to pop up that Messiah. And perhaps he thought if he could pull a few tricks here, he might be able to eliminate that whole thing. We could solve that problem of that promise of the
And he
Messiah.
tried again in the days of Esther. One decree, eliminate all the Jews. He thought he was that close. And then, of course, Herod tried to eliminate all the boy babies, including Jesus. The devil got what he thought was close several times.
And Revelation says that at the end of time, there'll be another death decree.
Mm-hmm.
Devil's going to try it again.
So, what do you think the Israelites learned from all those plagues? Not what the Egyptians learned, what did the Israelites learn?
You're referring to the 10
plagues of Egypt.
Sometimes you wonder what they learned wasn't very lasting with this group. You know, I mean, such a strong display of the omnipotence of God and what God can do.
Is it because they had 100 years to feel like their God was useless?
I don't think that helped at all.
So why did God do that? Why did he wait 100 years?
Well, part of it is so they could become a nation. They were reproducing. They were busy.
Okay.
Matter of fact, that's how the midwives saved their neck when they didn't kill the boy babies. They said, well, these Israelite women, they're different. They have the baby before we can get there.
Yeah, right. Pop them out.
Well, there may have been social and political circumstances too, why the Lord didn't lead them out of Egypt, which we're just really not aware of.
Mm-hmm. And by the time, by the way, and you know, moving on fairly quickly, the thing that really grabs people's attention about the plagues is the killing of the firstborn. What was that all about?
Well, what were all the plagues about?
Yes.
All the plagues were to show the Egyptians that their gods were powerless.
And where would you read the verse that shows that?
I think it's Exodus 12:12.
That's correct. Exodus 12:12. On that night, speaking specifically about the killing of the firstborn, God says, on that night, this is God speaking, I will go through the land of Egypt, killing every firstborn male, both human and animal, and punishing who? All the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So this is a showdown. Will the real God please stand up?
So the firstborns were gods?
Well, the firstborns of Pharaoh were considered to be the next god. Pharaohs, some of the pharaohs, not all the pharaohs, some of the pharaohs declared that they were gods. So the firstborn would be the next pharaoh, the potential for declaring himself a god. But there's another side to it, and that's that when you live in a society of that kind, the firstborn males were considered to be the cream of the crop. They're the ones who are going to carry on, you know, the next generation, etc. So they're the ones that would be especially protected by all the gods, right? So if you want to attack all the gods at one time and show their impotence, what do? You attack the firstborn. Not one of the Egyptian gods could do a thing about it.
I noticed that Moses wasn't the firstborn in his family, was
No. But Aaron wasn't killed either.
he? Yeah.
You know, I was looking here and I can't seem to find it, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that I recall that when Moses stood in front of Pharaoh that first time to deliver, he announced that he was there, and he said that the Israelites were God's firstborn, or God's first child. So it's as if that God was using this parallel or this metaphor that the other gods were using, but maybe I don't know. You know how it is. You look for things and you think, then you can't find them till later. But it seemed like I encountered that.
Could you raise the question that the author of this history him or herself, did not completely understand the methods of God? Some strange things are going on here that you would have to say, you look at it, he says, really? In other words, when do we say, for instance, that God kills.
Well,
See, that's a
the issue here, there's two issues here that are really important. The first question is, what death was involved? This is only the first death. This is not the second death. So every single one of those firstborn will be resurrected, either in the first resurrection or the second resurrection at the end. So to God, this is just a sleep. He said, I need you out of the picture for right now. And you'll come back sometime later, and you will be judged fairly just like everybody else. So the fact that they were killed even by God directly doesn't mean that they're eternally lost. There wasn't some kind of, special firstborn sin.
They died because they were firstborn, not because God was mad at them.
Exactly.
Does anyone die because God's mad at them?
Well, it didn't even appear like it.
Well, we have to realize that this was the final plague. God didn't choose this method at first. The first three plagues, they were just kind of an inconvenience, a nuisance. And things kept getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, recalling what we studied previously, and people probably remember, is that even the priests began to tell Pharaoh, look, you need to let these people go, you need to respond to this God, and so on and so forth. So this seemed to be the only thing that Pharaoh would respond to, and God is trying to get through to Pharaoh.
Even that didn't last long, because a few days later he's chasing the Israelites down through the desert.
It's easy for us to conclude that God was really trying to get even with Pharaoh, but God was trying to save Pharaoh too.
But then, I'm doing the devil's advocate here.
Please.
Then you could say is that if you displease God, you're liable to be cut off. That's experience.
Well,
Cut off from what?
From life.
So,
Kill you.
Cut off from doing more harm to others. Maybe even to yourself, but
Yeah.
certainly to others.
So, better take a look at James 1:13. See, it says, God does not do evil, neither does he tempt evil.
so putting somebody to sleep isn't evil.
Killing? I mean, after all, isn't the commandment, thou shalt not kill?
I mean,
Murder.
anesthesiologists do it every day. They put people to sleep, wake them up, we don't get mad at them.
that's right.
That's what God's doing, putting them to sleep, wake them up later.
But you can't say that they're dead.
Well, for all functional purposes they are.
A bit of a stretch there.
Well, anesthesiology is the human version. Death is God's version. I mean, it's just as easy for God to raise them back to life as it is for an anesthesiologist to bring a person out of anesthesia.
Probably easier for God.
Probably easier.
Well, but generally one volunteers to be anesthetized.
Does that make a difference?
Well, kind of.
Not always. Sometimes it's a life-threatening situation.
Ken, you said there were two things we should learn from the death of the firstborn. One was it's the first death.
Yes.
And I missed the second one.
Well, the second one is more complicated, and that's the question: does God kill people? If so, and not in the first death, but in the second death. So where do we go with the second death? Well, that's another whole story, and I would say that God doesn't kill death. God doesn't kill people in that death either, particularly in that death. The issue here, I think, is that, and the part that's hard for us to sort of get through our heads, is that sin is deadly. We're surrounded with it. We're inhabited by it. We think in terms of sin all the time. Maybe not on purpose, but we're in it. We're drowning in it, and so we think, oh well, that's pretty normal behavior, God says it's deadly.
It is. But no death, first or second, can happen without God's passive will saying okay.
Yeah.
Or another alternative to that. By the way, you and I agree on that very much. On that, or another way that we could really say this is, and I'm going back to Hebrews 3 and 4 on this, where he quotes Psalms 95, 7-11. And the reason why they died the children of Israel without seeing the promised land is they refuse to follow God, and God is not going to impose his will upon anyone in that situation. So you could say is that the end of time, sin is just so bad that these people have totally refused God's protection from the deleterious effects of evil.
It wasn't that they were refusing God's, although that's in effect what happened, I agree with you, but that wasn't what they believed they were doing. They were looking for all the privileges with none of the responsibilities.
Oh, you're absolutely right on that.
God says, if you follow me, I will do all these things for you. And they said, thank you for doing all those things for us. We'll think about the following.
So, looking at this here, the 10th plague, then you could argue the point. The death of the firstborn is because there were certain people who refused the protection of God. Even the Egyptians were given that opportunity. It was a kind of a worship by putting the blood on the doorposts and overhead. And the Egyptians, some of the Egyptians did it too. We read about it and can do it. And whatever caused the death, I can believe that the author here, being mostly pagan, not a Christian, he looks at that, and you know, back in the Old Testament time, and nowadays too, anything good, bad, or indifferent, we blame on God. In other words, not really realizing the full majesty, power, and love of God.
But if the Egyptians didn't keep animals, that's why they separated the Israelites, would it have been easy for them to get an animal to slaughter and do it just right and paint the blood on the doorposts and so forth? That's another question.
Well, it was an agricultural economy. They probably had plenty of that.
Yeah, I'm sure they must have had some. Well, when the children of Israel finally got out of Egypt and were miraculously helped across the Red Sea, fairly quickly they ended up at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai has all kinds of implications. What happened there? What do you think of, first of all? What jumps out in your mind when someone says Mount Sinai?
Giving the law.
Giving of the law. The Ten Commandment law particularly was given, and that's recorded as in Exodus 20, 3 to 17 is the place we usually quote from. And so what else happened there?
There's a mountain there, and the people camp down at the base as they're instructed. And Moses goes up into the mountain, and he's there for about 40 days, I believe.
First time.
And when he comes down, he has those commandments, and he finds the people in rebellion down there, doing things that they know they're not supposed to be doing.
But even before that, is that God gave a lot of instructions to these people for the commandments. And the people says, God, everything that you said, we will do. And it said that Moses went back to the Lord to deliver that message that the people were going to do everything he said. This is really the beginning of what we call the Old Covenant.
Right. They said that 3 times.
Yeah.
Exodus 19, I think it's around about verse 8. Exodus 24, 3, verse 3 and verse 7, 3 times. God says, are you sure you heard that right? Let me read it to you again. Okay, all that the Lord has said we will do.
Yeah, so the old covenant really is basically a works-based relationship with God.
Well, and another way of saying that is the people made the promises, and they couldn't keep them.
It wasn't God that made the promise.
No,
it was
in the
people.
new covenant, it's God that makes the promises.
Right.
The reason that one of the reasons that the people made all these promises is because God showed his power from the mountain. That's another thing that's there. The lightning, the thunder, the earthquake, the loud, everything loud, and just a great display of power. And they basically fell down on their faces and said, anything, we'll do anything.
It's interesting to read that, yes.
One, they really thought they could. They thought, we can do this. So whatever God wants us to do, we will do. And that was their problem. They couldn't do it. Also, they thought if they did it, then they had God where they wanted him. They could get all the promises, they could get everything he said, if they just performed. So by performing, they expected to earn their salvation, as it were.
How much could they do? If they couldn't do all of it, how much could they do? 50%, 10%, any of
Probably
it?
none, because what they did was for a wrong motive.
What is it they're supposed to be doing that they've agreed to do that they can't do?
Keep the commandments. That was basically what it was.
Then why in the world are we given those things if you can't keep them?
Well, we're certainly not saved by
I
them.
thought that's what we were supposed to. I thought at the end time that's
the
what
10
people keeping the commandments are the ones that are going to be
Now you're already over in the book of Revelation.
the good guys. Well, it's right here too, I'm sure.
We as Seventh-day Adventists have been given some additional instructions which say that the 10 Commandments were given to show us what kind of people it's safe to have in heaven.
Well, what is it going to take to make, I mean, these people thought, well, here's what we're supposed to be like. So if this is what we're supposed to be like, we must be able to do it. So we'll agree. Doesn't that seem to make perfect sense? I mean, I can see me right there at the mountain. Well, sure, I'll do that. Give it a good shot anyway.
But why?
Morm
what
says
actually
that even a good shot isn't any good.
What happened there? Let's understand very clearly. God came down on the top of that mountain. There was a black cloud. There was lightning shooting out of that thing. There was fire. I don't know whether, I guess they saw the fire at the bottom or whatever. And down on top of that mountain, and there was the pillar of cloud and so forth up above it there. And the thunder blasted out. And what were they doing?
Trembling at the bottom.
They were down there with the noses in the dirt. They were down there and they were scared to death. And what was the response? Well, the response is found in Exodus 20, 18 to 20. Let's just look at that real quick. When the people heard the thunder and the trumpet blast, saw the lightning and the smoky mountain, those are the things I've just talked about, they trembled with fear and stood a long way off. They said, and I should back up to talk about where it says, let's see. Anyway, they stood a long way out. They said to Moses, if you will speak to us, we will listen, but we are afraid that if God speaks to us, we will die. Moses replied, don't be afraid. God has only come to test you and make you keep on obeying him so that you will not sin. But the people continued to stand a long way off, and only Moses went near the dark cloud where God was.
Well, see there, right there, even Moses says that he is testing you to make you keep them obeying him so you will not sin. So there's that obeying business.
You know, their experience was really with paganism, the gods that didn't do anything. And now God is showing them, hey, I can make the whole world tremble.
And this is a very important point, because they were used to gods that you could touch and see and that looked impressive but couldn't do anything. And now all of a sudden they're dealing with a God that they couldn't touch, they couldn't see, but he could do everything. I mean, this is a real upside down situation. They hadn't run across this one before. See? And you know, it was a little scary. And the question I'm going to ask you, because it's about time to take a break, the question I'm going to ask you to think about and to answer when we come back is this. What were they asking for? The children of Israel, when they said those words to Moses, what were they asking for? And do we have any other experiences where that sort of thing happened in Scripture? You try to answer too. Welcome back. We're so glad you decided to stay by. I left you with a question to think about. What were the children of Israel asking for? Let me read the verse again. They said to Moses, this is Exodus 20:19, only 2 verses, well, only 1 verse between that and the end of the 10 Commandments. They said to Moses, if you speak to us, we will listen, but we are afraid that if God speaks to us, we will die. Moses, of course, said no and so forth, but they were asking for a mediator, an intercessor between them and God. And this is actually the first time in history anything like that is mentioned. There's no intercessors mentioned in Genesis. This is the first time an intercessor is mentioned. Now, we know that Christians have made a great deal of the idea of intercession from there on through the rest of Scripture. But it's not God who's offering to be an intercessor. It's the people who are begging for an intercessor. What does that tell us?
Intercessors are a bad idea.
because humans had the idea it must be a bad one, huh?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
it's an accommodation to the where they were at.
Well, it's also a pagan concept because the pagan priest was an intercessor between them as they perceived and their God. That idol was in some back room of the temple.
Well,
And they feared that he was afraid if you didn't do what he told you to do, he would zap you or not,
That's
give, you,
right.
not,
In other
not
words-
give you anything to eat for the next year.
There's parallels here.
doesn't this make some sense, though? I mean, good grief, we didn't read it here, but when you read the account, I mean, the whole mountain was shaking. And there was smoking up there, and there was lightning, and I'm not talking about just some thunderstorm. It was, you know, it was probably an experience on the top of a mountain like you've never seen before. And I'm sure the ground was shaking where those people were too. And Moses goes up, and he comes down, and he seems to be okay.
Yeah,
And-
after 40 days. I mean, what would you think if the one really trustworthy, visible leader that you have disappears into the fire and you all watch him?
And so it just
What do you
seems-
say next?
It seems natural to think that, man, we're scared spitless, but he seems to be able to handle this, so we want to communicate with this God. So Moses, you do it because you seem to be able to do it okay. But we're afraid to do that.
We're not going to rush up there into the fire?
What the people did was ask for a God that they could see and touch and feel
And
and dance
control.
around and control, yeah. A golden calf.
And that's the story in Exodus 32.
But once again, wherever you find these situations, you find a history with events that if you will just make an assessment of those events, prove that there's no reason for you to take the position. They've already been under tremendous care of God through those plagues.
Sure.
So, and good grief, they came to the big body of water and opened up. God has proved himself.
Don't you think we have the same problem today?
Can you?
Yeah, we do.
Can you imagine what what they would have thought? Here comes Moses. He gives these things, and Moses says, "What you going to do about it?" And the committee came up and says, "Well, these are way too much for us. We can't do any of these things. You're going to have another negotiating session with God."
Yeah.
Now, what do you expect them to say?
I saw a cartoon one time that I think about when we come to this story every time. It shows Joshua and Moses coming down the mountain. And you can see in the distance, you can see them dancing around the golden calf. And Moses has this shocked look on his face, and he drops the 2 tables of stone, and you know they're smashed in pieces. And Joshua says, "You break all 10 of them at the same time," and all you can say is, "Oops."
You know, Roland commented that we're kind of the same. You know, most of us don't have these big, flashy experiences like this. But we do have experiences. We'll pray for God's intervention in our life, and we can see that intervention if we'll pay attention. But really, just like there in our lives today, God is proving that, you know, I'm a power in your life, and I will give you more and more power. But we don't interpret it that way. At least I don't. Well, I do interpret it, but most of the time I'm too numb to, I just get what I asked for and go on and forget.
Mm-hmm.
And don't realize that, here's a little bit. It's a taste of what you can have. Here's a little bit. I'll give you some more. The more more responsibility you assume and can handle, the more I will give you.
Yeah. Well, the next major thing that happens is they build the tabernacle. They spent a year at the foot of Mount Sinai putting together that tabernacle. And there's a lot of detail. And if you think about it, half of human history is recorded in the book of Genesis. At least half of human history. If we go back as far as it started, we go down to the end of Genesis, we're basically halfway through human history. We got one tiny little book. Now we come to Exodus, and all of a sudden we have the details. Make this, and this, make it this size, and this connects to that, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Chapters of these details. Why is that necessary? Couldn't God have just said, here's the plan, go and build it?
And it's repeated.
It's repeated.
Make sure that you got it right.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very clear that, well, and of course the major event that happens at the tabernacle is what? What's the major event that happens at the tabernacle?
Well, the glory of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
After
Well,
they finished,
that was at the beginning, yeah, exactly. But in terms of what happened every day, what was
everyday sacrifices?
everyday sacrifices, the sacrificing of animals. What would you do if all of a sudden we discovered that we had misinterpreted Scripture or something, and it was time for us to sacrifice animals again?
Well, then we would do it. Well, you just said we'd misinterpret it, so
I'd go back
that would be
and read it again.
that would be the assumption that, well, we've overlooked it and we're supposed to be doing it. So, are you?
Could you kill a baby lamb?
Well, we do it worse these days. We kill them and eat them. So.
I don't.
Well, I don't either.
And I don't eat. So.
Well, no, but some it's considered a delicacy. But
Yes.
I would feel kind of funny taking it up some altar.
But there are some Christian groups that insist that we should keep the 7 festivals.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were agricultural festivals. We need to keep those. So that's an impartial answer to your question. At least they don't talk about sacrifices. But I think there are some Christians, some places in the world that do sacrifices still. And some places in Ethiopia, as an example, and so forth.
Yeah. There are other groups, maybe a few Christian groups. There's others, the Druze and others in Israel, still sacrifice animals once in a while. They would probably have some problems in this country with SPCA, I would think. Although I don't know why SPCA stays out of the big meat companies. Why don't they do something about that?
Well, it's probably because they eat meat too.
Yeah,
Some of them.
some of them.
It would be a very traumatic experience, I think, for myself, if I thought I had to do that.
Well, isn't that the whole point? Have a
I
traumatic
think it
experience?
is, but I don't
But
think that's what's needed for me at this point.
well, as we think this way, you must recognize, and this happens to be an interest of mine, is that the Canaanites, religious runner, they also sacrifice animals for the same reasons given. In other words, in fact, in the
This is not a unique experience.
no, it isn't. And the Hittites, they found tablets where they describe what the sacrifice do. It was a propitiation to their gods. That was the way.
Who got it from where? Did
Yeah.
they get it from Abraham and before that? Or did
Well,
God make an adjustment and say, you people want sacrifices, well, we'll do it this way?
Well, we have no record in Scripture
We have no proof one way or the other.
that it has, but certainly their pagan neighbors did, and it's easy to
And-
demonstrate they picked it up from them.
And there are temples designed almost exactly like the Israelite temple or tabernacle that were built hundreds of years before they built one.
Yeah, the Egyptians, they were 2-room temples, and the god was in a isolated room. That way, we talked about, it was an attempt then, I can control my God. I have an intercessor, a priest.
Well, we look at the Ten Commandments, and Jay seems like think he can keep them, and Norm doesn't think he can.
Yeah, we've seen that, Norm. we go along with you on that, yeah.
But there's, you know, one of the things that we don't notice about the Ten Commandments is something that you have to do a little more research. If you go through and you start looking through the rest of Exodus and you look through Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you discover that every single one of the Ten Commandments, with the exception of number 10, we'll talk about that in a moment, has a death decree attached to breaking it. Do you think they ever actually followed that? How many Israelites would be left?
Yes, they did follow it.
Occasionally.
So, at least sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Occasionally. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but what was that supposed to teach us? I mean, how many sermons have you heard about the fact that the Ten Commandments had a death decree? Each one of them had a death decree connected to it.
Well, sin is deadly in any of its forms.
Doesn't need a death decree attached to it?
Mm-mm.
We don't seem to feel like it's deadly.
That's our problem.
We sit here and we swig down the poison and we don't think it's any problem at all.
We have done worse than they.
But that's a good point, because that, you know, the Ten Commandments in essence defines what evil is.
Mm-hmm.
And evil is totally destructive. And the only reason why it isn't totally destructive is that because God, by the breath of his mouth, sustains us.
I think some of our audience might question my statements there about the death decrees. So let's look at a couple of verses, and then if you want to know more, you can go to our website. Our website is theox.org, theox.org, and look under the teacher's guide for the book of Leviticus, and you'll find some very interesting stuff there. But let me just illustrate. Let's take, for example, Exodus 20, verse 3, the very first commandment. My version, you know, the King James says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before thee." My version says, "Worship no God but me." And if you turn over to Exodus 22, verse 20, it says, "Condemn to death anyone who offers sacrifices to any god except to me, the Lord." What does that mean?
It's a death decree.
It's a death decree. And I could give you a lot more. Leviticus 20, verse 2, Numbers 25, verse 5, Deuteronomy 17, 2 to 5, Deuteronomy 13, 5, Deuteronomy, I mean, that goes on and on. And that's just for the first commandment. So God seems to think this is serious.
Well, but if you get up to that temple with your lamb, see,
Mm-hmm.
then that takes care of it.
If you were designed and created into an orderly system of cause and effect,
Mm-hmm.
and God gives you some guidelines to help you understand and stay within those guidelines and stay within the system that will keep you alive and nourish you, to step out of that is death.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't be sustained with peanut butter in the gas tank.
Okay,
So is that
fire won't go very far, huh?
No.
Is that what the understanding was, is that if you don't get up there with the lamb, then they're to put you to death? Or if you get up there with the lamb and you get that forgiveness?
It doesn't say anything about lambs in those verses where it talks about they're supposed to be, it says they're supposed to be put to death. They're supposed to be stoned to death. And it doesn't say anything about, well, if they don't get their lamb up on time. Nothing about that at all.
But that's after God has given those commandments. When God gave the commandments, did he refer to the death being the result of that sin will cause you to separate yourself from me and you die?
And that's one of the things. One of the things is in these next few books that we're going to look at, There's almost no explanation for anything. It just says, do this, do this, do this, do this. And there's no explanation.
What do you do to a 2-year-old? Do you explain to them why you don't stick your finger in the light socket?
Of course. I sit down and give them a half-hour lecture. No.
Yeah, I tried that with my kids, and you know where it got me?
A finger in the socket.
You mean like this? Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well,
I think it's one thing of interest on the same vein. If you go to verse 23 of Exodus 20, what goes on from 21 for several chapters, you can almost come to that the Lord didn't say this directly. This is Moses saying this.
mm-hmm.
Because then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites this.
You're reading for which one?
Verse
Where's the
22, chapter 20
Of Exodus.
of Exodus, yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
So it would seem, did the Lord say this himself, or did he instruct Moses? And these are really decrees of Moses. You might say, well, that's a small thing. But then if you say this, actually Moses saying it, add the decree, you're going to be killed if you violate each one of these decrees. Maybe put a little different flavor on that.
Are you trying to say my scripture is not as powerful as it sounds?
Are you trying to get God off the hook?
No, but I think that when we take a look at the Old Testament, we have to ask ourselves the questions. How well did these people, just coming out of Egypt, including Moses, how well did they know God?
I want to read you, in light of that, I want to read a few verses from Exodus 23. It almost immediately God says, let me tell you exactly what I have in mind for our relationship, okay? I'm going to read Exodus 23, starting with verse 20. And my Bible calls this promises and instructions. God saying, I will send an angel ahead of you to protect you as you travel and to bring you to the place which I have prepared. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? Pay attention to him and obey him. Now there's some requirements here. Do not rebel against him, for I have sent him, and he will not pardon such rebellion. But if you obey him and do everything I command you, I will fight against all your enemies. My angel will go ahead of you and take you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will destroy them. Do not bow down to their gods or worship them, and do not adopt their religious practices. Destroy their gods and break down their sacred stone pillars. If you worship me, the Lord your God, I will bless you with food and water and take away all your sicknesses. In your land no woman will have a miscarriage or be without children. I will give you long lives. I mean, what more could you ask for? I will make the people who oppose you afraid of me. I will bring confusion among the people against whom you fight. I will make all your enemies turn and run from you. I will throw your enemies into panic. I will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites as you advance. I will not drive them out within a year's time. If I did, the land would become deserted and the wild animals would be too much for you. Instead, I will drive them out little by little until there are enough of you to take possession of the land. I will make the borders of your land extend from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Mediterranean Sea and from the desert to the Euphrates River. I will give you power over the inhabitants of the land, and you will drive them out as you advance. Do not make any agreement with them or with your gods, with their gods. Do not let those people live in your country. If you do, they will make you sin against me. If you worship their gods, it will be a fatal trap for you.
So I have two comments about that. See there, Norm, it is possible to keep all those commandments. Must be. And number two, how would you read this passage? Can you find yourself, Ken, standing before someone who's being burned at the stake?
Mm-hmm.
And reading them this passage? It doesn't sound to me like those faithful martyrs are being protected. Or classic example is good old Stephen and the stoning of Stephen. I bet he read this lots of times.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't seem to experience any of these things. So how do we Norm, how are you going to answer? And Ken, how are you going to answer?
By faith, Stephen got a look at something far greater than what he had around him. Moses got a look into the future and saw a whole host of things that he wouldn't participate in here, but it was going to be a whole lot better. They may not be able to experience it here, but this is a little fragment of almost insignificant time until the real thing takes over. And if we get focused on this little bit of time, we are in deep, deep weeds.
Yeah.
But then again, you take a look at this. We have no knowledge until we get to heaven how much we have been protected by God. We just, things have happened and we have no concept of it.
That's right.
But it's very hard when you're living today. I mean, I saw a patient walking down the hall today. It was obvious he was on the oncology ward and he was in his last days. It's very hard to look at that patient and go, I'm sorry.
Don't worry, God will take care of you.
Exactly. I mean, he's living daily knowing he's going to die. Mm-hmm. Why, when he's given the diagnosis of cancer, why can't he just die? You know, he has to live out that process, and it's in front of you every day.
That gives you an opportunity to tell him something about where his future is headed.
True, but for that patient that doesn't have that, you know, he wasn't my patient, I just saw him in the hall and it was obvious, but we have a responsibility. And I think that's probably the core of the situation. But for that person out there that doesn't have someone to help them with that, how do they live and look at God as a loving, kind God?
The really sad part is we're going to find out when we get to Deuteronomy that God had to revise his instructions. And he had to tell the children of Israel, I'm not going to go ahead of you. I'm not going to take care of everything. You're going to have to take your swords. You're going to have to kill everything that breathes. You're going to have to destroy the pregnant women. You're going to have to destroy the kids, etc.
Or another alternative could go along with it. Or maybe even here, that God was not totally understood.
So I don't know. Almost a given, isn't it? I mean,
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons
but
why.
What's the point then?
Well, what I'm saying is, did God really say this? Or remember, we're reading this through the eyes of somebody else, a very human being who's written this down, who understands God in this context.
But hold on. Here's the and I still understand where you're going, but I have this question. See,
I don't. I haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah. No, I understand it. Here's the problem. God knew exactly how this was going to come out. He even knew how it was going to come out in my version in 2011 and on in the future. And if he didn't want it, if he thought this was completely going to mislead us, if he didn't want it to come out like this, he should have done something different back in the beginning.
But to do it different with the kind of people, then we get into the question of free will.
Yeah.
In other words, does God dictate this way, or is it God just simply saying is, okay, this is the way you believe, we'll work on it? Because after all, didn't the author of Hebrews say in Hebrews 1 and 2, he says, in the times past, God spoke to us through the prophets. They didn't understand us completely. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. In other words, we're going to get it straight. In other words, God isn't hurt or harmed, or it doesn't fear because people don't understand him completely. He understands that.
Isn't it progressive revelation because of the progressive perception on the part of his creatures?
Sure. Or progressive understanding.
Well, perception, understanding, sure.
So then is this big promise you read of all these my angels will go ahead of you and I'm going to take care of all your enemies and you're going to have lots of food? Is that some kind of a metaphor for what's going to happen in heaven? It's not really going to happen here?
Let me give you an example of this. 2 Samuel 5. Mm-hmm. And David is out there getting ready to fight the Philistines. Well, I'm not going to argue about the Philistines. And what did the Lord do? He sent a hail down. Mm-hmm. And the Philistines understood this as being supernatural, and they took off running. In other words, yeah, David, in a sense, defeated the Philistines. It was at Mount Perazim.
Yeah, and there are
other things like that too, that God has ways of handling, which he's talking about here, which could be misunderstood.
And why? I just have so many whys. We haven't got on to the book of Joshua and Judges. Why, when the children of Israel saw the walls of Jericho fall down, for example, and on to other examples like the one you mentioned, and you know, Gideon and his experience.
Oh, yeah.
Why didn't they say, you know, that worked pretty well. If we just cooperate with God, things will work out fine. No, they wanted to do it themselves. And the only possible explanation I can give is they thought, well, you know, if we let God do it, we'll look like a bunch of wimps. We didn't do anything. We didn't beat the enemy with our swords and our spears. God did all the hard work. Of course, what they should have recognized that they couldn't do it even if they wanted to.
But even Abraham did that. When he said, God said I was going to be the father of how many? And it's not happening.
Nations.
Maybe I need to help him out.
Do we ever do anything like that?
Oh, never.
Patience is not our virtue. That's
I
all.
see.
Ken, what have we learned about God from this section of
Exodus?
the books of Moses?
Yeah, we've talked mostly about Exodus. What we have seen is that God was working with a very rebellious and probably ignorant group of people. And it took him, first of all, a lot of action down in Egypt to get them to realize that, hey, this God of ours isn't just a wimp. He can actually do something. But they had a lot of problems with the fact that they couldn't see him, they couldn't touch him, they couldn't control him. I mean, here's a God who's controlling them, telling them what to do. I mean, this was a totally new experience. They hadn't been told what to do by the gods of Egypt. Those are a chunk of wood or a chunk of stone. You know, they didn't have any power to do anything down there. They thought gods, you turn around and face them the other direction, they won't be able to see what you're doing behind their back here. You know, they were used to that kind of stuff. But here God took them to Mount Sinai and they saw a very, very different picture. We need to think about the implications of that even for our lives. We'll see you again next week.